Since 2017, the gaming world has waited and wondered if a small team of developers from Sweden could catch lightning in a bottle with a new twist on a tried and true genre. Hey there friends, it's Codiak here, one half of the team behind Legacy Gaming, and today we're diving into Biomutant, putting our collective 120 hours of experience to the test and revealing if this brand new open world adventure RPG is worth your time. When it comes to open world games, the sky is the limit, quite literally. And while players have become accustomed to the massively sprawling worlds of Assassin's Creed, The Witcher 3, and Grand Theft Auto, there has always been this hunger for something new, something no one else has ever tried before. Enter Biomutant. Revealed in 2017, Biomutant took the entire gaming world by surprise. An enthralling cinematic trailer introduced players to a new world, a new hero, and an entirely new concept. Little was known at the time, but after years of waiting and wondering, the world of Biomutant has finally been revealed. For the sake of total transparency, I want to say that Legacy Gaming did receive an advanced copy of this game. In fact, Livid and myself have been playing Biomutant for nearly 2 weeks, and collectively between the two of us, we have around 120 hours with the game. It's rare that we get this much time to fully experience a game ahead of launch, but in our opinion, that means more time digging into the content, pushing the limits of the game, and getting you the best information as soon as possible. Now, for anyone that may not be as up to date on the game, let's start this worth your time review as we always do with a 30,000 foot view. Biomutant, as I said, is an open-world action-adventure RPG. You play as a mutated creature that must navigate a world on the brink of destruction as you confront 4 massive World Eater bosses, while also coming face-to-face with your past and the creature that ripped apart your family. You'll spend anywhere from 10 to over 100 hours exploring a post-apocalyptic world as you meet strange creatures, confront mutated enemies, complete quests, and search for bizarre loot. Your adventures in Biomutant will start by creating a character, something you've no doubt experienced countless times before. While the game doesn't feature the most in-depth character customization we've ever seen, it does take a shot at being different. You'll choose between a handful of races, each with their own slight advantages and disadvantages when it comes to stats. You'll then take your character and splice them to your heart's content, changing up their stats and their look in a fluid yet unique process that ensures a one-of-a-kind character. You'll then have to choose the fur pattern and color options. Finally, and most importantly, you'll have to choose a class. The game features 6 classes, or loadouts: the Deadeye, the Commando, the Psy-Freak, the Saboteur, the Sentinel, and the Mercenary, a pre-order exclusive that will be available to everyone at some point after launch. Classes define your playstyle and provide players with specific class perks, but aren't so limiting that they lock you in for good. No matter which class you choose to play, you'll be able to adjust later on and do nearly everything. Every character can equip a melee weapon, a ranged weapon, and can swap seamlessly between them during combat. Couple that with up to 4 active abilities and you've got yourself a recipe for destruction. The game's combat is heavily influenced by Kung Fu and is much more action-based than your more standard RPGs. Pulling from the fighting genre, you'll input your attacks in specific sequences that will then allow you to execute special moves. Combine 3 different special moves in sequence and tap into your Super Wung Fu abilities, a bullet time mode that allows players to unleash a flurry of ranged and melee attacks on their enemies. Combat even extends to the mounts within the game, and whether you're riding or controlling a mech, you'll always have some firepower at your fingertips. The game features a number of unique systems, but none are more impressive than crafting, which is easily the highlight of the experience. Mix and match hundreds of item parts to create melee and ranged weapons, as well as armor I guarantee you've never seen before. The more you explore, the more you can create, and by the end of your adventures, you're left with millions of potential builds. And yes, you heard me right, I said millions. Other things like a morality system attempt to add some depth to the gameplay by tilting players towards the light or the dark. Through some simple dialogue options and decision making, your aura will shift, and that gives you access to different abilities and some different choices when talking to the various NPCs found all over the world. Finally, let's talk about exploration. As I mentioned, Biomutant is set in a post-apocalyptic world. Humans are long gone, but the things they built are not. Dilapidated buildings are filled to the brim with enemies, loot, and puzzles, and the various biomes will constantly keep you on your toes, especially early on as you try to survive in a number of different extreme elements. Luckily, getting around is pretty simple, and through a combination of mounts, abilities, and a fast travel system, it's easy enough to traverse the map and reach any destination you have in mind. With a basic understanding of the game under our belts, it's time we start our adventures. And if you're thinking to yourself, boy, that sure was a lot of stuff to think about before even getting going, you'd be right. One thing Biomutant attempts to do is throw a lot of different ideas at you. You've got the main story involving the World Eaters, the secondary story involving your past and an evil arch-nemesis, and finally a tribe war that forces you to choose sides in a bloody conflict between 6 warring factions. Add on to that the various combat, crafting, and quest systems that you have to figure out, and you'll spend a fair bit of time just trying to get your bearings within the game. For anyone that's experienced an open world title before, this is pretty common. But because Biomutant is a new IP, it takes some extra time to get adjusted to the way Experiment 101, the developers, do things within the game. Biomutant throws everything and the kitchen sink at players, and this, at the most foundational level, is the game's biggest issue. Experiment 101 isn't CD Projekt Red. They're not Rockstar, Bethesda, or any other developer that's successfully launched an open-world game. They're a new studio of around 20 members attempting to take on one of the most challenging and resource-intensive genres in the video game landscape, and at times, it shows. Biomutant is charming, quirky, and it definitely grows on you the more you play it. But at the end of the day, it does fail to reach that level of polish and depth I think a lot of people hoped it would. Now let me explain. For starters, let's talk about combat. The game's martial arts inspiration is interesting and the combos are simple enough to execute, but the fighting never really feels rewarding. Range combat is vastly superior to melee combat, and that largely boils down to the subpar dodging and parrying systems within the game. It's nearly impossible to see when enemies are executing their moves, and rarely do they stop their actions even if you hit them first, which makes melee combat often more trouble than it's worth. That leaves you with 2 options: use your abilities or use your guns. Sadly, abilities are just not balanced well enough to be viable, and after a few hours into the game, you realize that they just don't hold up next to the weapons. I will say the mutations and psionic abilities are unique, so hats off to the team for leaning into the quirky nature of the game in that regard. But when push comes to shove, I spent more time staying back and just firing my gun into a mass of enemies until eventually they were all dead. Livid even tried to main a Psy-Freak in his first playthrough, a class dedicated to pushing the boundaries of the abilities in the game, and still ended up falling back onto guns for most of the combat. The pinnacle of the combat, Super Wung Fu, was probably the most lackluster element of the fighting. What looked to be a promising system that rewarded players for their prowess in combat ended up being a pseudo slow time mode that allowed players to spam some buttons to score some extra damage. Effective, yes, but far from engaging. Where the combat takes a turn for the better is in the boss fights. We're talking larger-than-life creatures that feature some unique mechanics, and for the most part, you're in a vehicle or mount taking on some of these World Eaters, and although I wouldn't classify them as the most polished boss fights I've ever done, they're plenty enjoyable even at the hardest difficulty. Combat is just one system within the game. Biomutant features a number of different ideas, and while they are all complete, they're not always the most satisfying. For instance, take the morality system. Yes, there is a light and dark side of the spectrum, and you can choose to let the world burn or be its savior, but outside of that, the system doesn't feel like it changes the player experience that drastically. Choosing to be good or bad does give you access to some different psionic abilities, as well as influence some dialogue options, but who you are never seems to permeate your character like it does in games like Fable. That light and dark feature does creep into other things like the tribe conflict as well. You align yourself with a light or dark tribe as you attempt to capture or pacify the entire region and claim unique tribe weapons as prizes. These are unique combat items with their own moveset and something a lot of players will discover in due time, but a secondary highlight within the game. What I do really enjoy is the flexibility to choose your path. Instead of picking light or dark, you can choose to be a bit of both, which guarantees you're never locked out of that content. That's been a big push by the developers since day one. Give players the freedom to create the adventures they want without limitations. That's a conscious decision, and we're definitely not going to fault them for that, but that may not be something everyone enjoys. The sad truth is that this system, as well as many other systems within the game, are just a bit basic. To help you better understand, let me put it like this. Each system has a foundation. We'll call that the A component. On top of that would be the depth, things that enhance the system, and we'll call that the B component. Finally, there are things that make the system special, those unique elements that make something truly different. We'll call that the C component. Biomutant has a lot of A components, the foundations, but has very few B components and next to no C components. The one area where Biomutant really puts all three of those components together is with the crafting. It's clear that the team puts so much thought and care into this system, and I think players are really going to love it. Because there are ways to combine and upgrade nearly everything you find, the possibilities are endless. And in this case, giving players everything, including the kitchen sink, works, because the team did such a good job building out the depth of the crafting system. To be fair, it's not perfect, and the stats themselves leave a lot to be desired, but the actual process of crafting items and creating items is incredibly satisfying. Crafting is ultimately hamstrung by the lack of diversity within the combat systems, and even though there are some base pieces that add combat perks into the mix, it's not enough to change up the combat in any truly meaningful way. Add on to this the point dump progression system that doesn't force players to make choices, but rather gives them everything with enough time, and what you end up with is a super powerful mutated creature with no real playstyle identity. Again, this was intentional design from the Experiment 101 team to prevent players from feeling cut off from certain aspects of the game. Unfortunately, this type of design is a double-edged sword. By giving players everything under the sun, every perk, every ability, access to everything in the game, nothing is truly special, because it all is achievable. Even the class identity, which we talked about briefly before, is diluted by the fact that you can pretty much bust out of that box with little resistance. This isn't inherently bad, and I want to double down on that, as it does make the game more accessible to all types of players, from casual to hardcore. But at the end of the day, having everything within reach does have its drawbacks. With all that being said, for a team of just 20 developers, you will not believe what Experiment 101 has managed to achieve. And while there are some shortcomings, there are also some things that AAA companies still can't implement into their games. Things like loadouts, which let you change your gear on the fly, are pivotal to the RPG experience, and Biomutant gets that right when other big games don't. Other systems like radio wheels to swap weapons may seem clunky to some, but to us it speaks volumes about the choices players are given to change their playstyle on the fly if that's something that they want to do. There aren't a lot of gameplay implications to do so, but it's a possibility. You can't forget about the world building either, creating an entirely new universe for players to explore, and the team has managed to pull it off. This is by no means a small feat or a small map, and while the world doesn't always feel lived in, the various biomes and landmarks help tie everything together. Layer on top of that the never-ending lines of narration, and you've got yourself something pretty unique. Not everyone is going to like the narration style, and the long exposition dumps can grind the pace to a halt, but if you're someone that enjoys learning about the world in the games that you play, you're in for a treat. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this worth your time review, it's this. Biomutant is the first project by a new studio that stepped outside of the norm to try something a bit different, and while it may not be a home run, it's far from a failure. To put it another way, Biomutant is a AA game in a AAA world, and that's something we just have to accept as players. This is the first project by Experiment 101. They have a smaller team and they're taking on a genre that is incredibly demanding, and what they've managed to accomplish is pretty remarkable. At the end of the day, is Biomutant worth your time? Yes, absolutely, but understand this. There are some rocky spots along the way that may derail your experience, but if you can push past the $60 price tag, the slower than normal intro sequence, and some of the more underdeveloped systems within the game, Biomutant will grow on you, just like it did for Livid and myself. If you're looking for that next-gen, big open-world game, something that'll blow your pants off, this isn't it. That's just the truth. But if you're like us and you want to support developers that are willing to try something different, even if it's not perfect, then this is absolutely a game worth checking out. We do see the $60 price tag being a bit of an issue for a lot of people, and to be blunt, I think a $40 price tag would be more palatable, but that's not something we can change at this point. Because it's a single-player game, not dependent on a live service model, the chances of this going on sale sooner rather than later are pretty good. I would expect to see Biomutant's price come down somewhere around the holidays in 2021, and that may honestly be the perfect time to pick up the game. Like I mentioned at the start of the video, there is plenty to sink your teeth into, and with a new game plus mode shipping at launch, if you're someone that does end up enjoying the game, you're looking at well over 50 hours of playtime, easy. I also want to quickly say that during my dozens of hours testing the game, I hardly ran across any bugs, and the same could be said for Livid. Again, for a small team, that's impressive. Truth be told, this is one of the most challenging video game reviews I've ever had to write. On one hand, we love the world, the weirdness, and some of the things the developers have managed to create. But on the other hand, it's hard to ignore how basic some aspects of the game are, and trying to explain that in just a handful of minutes is nearly impossible. Players across the spectrum are going to experience this game differently, and I wouldn't be surprised if we see both ends of the spectrum, players that absolutely love the game and players that absolutely don't. It's a hard needle to thread, but hopefully we've done our jobs and shown you enough of the game so that you can make an informed decision yourself. As always, if you have any questions about the game or you want us to go into more details about anything we discussed in the video, we encourage you to leave a comment below. We do our best to answer any and all questions you might have about the game, so feel free to drop us a line. You can also join us on Discord. Our community of nearly 7,000 is spread across dozens of great games, so check out the link below to join today. Finally, if you like our videos and you want to support the channel even more, consider becoming a member of the Legacy Gaming community. For the cost of a cup of coffee, you're helping us reach our goal of becoming full-time content creators and take our channel to that next level. My name is Codiak, and from everyone here at Legacy Gaming, thanks for watching, and play on.